This is a Pioneer CT-F900, which was built in the late 1970s. I have refurbished this deck, and I will go through the points of refurbishment as we walk through. You're probably used to my videos where I start off with a faceplate taken off, and the reason that I do that is so that I can go through and point out some of the things that I've done, so that you're aware of not only the maintenance that's been done on this deck, but you can see sort of the good, bad, and the ugly. So we'll get started with that. I'll go through what's been done on the transport, then I'll go off tripod and we'll take a look at some of the components on the inside, and then we'll resume with the faceplate and the top one, and we'll go through some tests. And those tests will be 3 different tape types that this can record. It can record on type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 3 was Ferrochrome. It cannot record type 4, which is metal, but it can play back a type 4 tape. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what has been done to the unit. As you know, this mechanism always suffers from the same issues. Belts have to be replaced, and this idler tire has to be replaced. Many times the spring holding this up has to be retensioned. A lot of work has to be done there to get that right, so that when the unit is functioning, you've got good take-up. See how good that torque is, and the rewind and the fast forward. That's all because of new tire, strengthened string, and for playback, the belts, which were replaced, there are actually 4 belts on this that get replaced, and they're all replaced with factory standard belts. So let's talk about some other things. As you know, this uses specially sized pinch rollers. And as I've said this many times, I've had people debate it with me, and quite frankly, I haven't had anybody prove me wrong. These assemblies are identical. They're just mirrored. This one has a small guide on top of it, but they both came originally with the same size pinch roller. Now these pinch rollers, if you're not going to buy this one, you want to buy something else that you see on eBay, make sure that they've changed the pinch rollers out. And you either gotten them refurbished or re-rubbered. I use Terry's rubber rollers. I'll send him a couple that I've pulled, and he'll send new ones back. These cost me $50 each. So you can already see I've put $100 into this deck just to make sure that I've got good pinch rollers. Occasionally I'll use an aftermarket on this side. In this case, I did not. I used a refurbished roller, and it's beautiful. When you do that, this has a height adjustment here, and that's why this has a new nylon nut on it, and it's painted. Also, you'll notice that there's paint on the azimuth for the head, because what I do is I use an oscilloscope and a factory test tape to set the azimuth so that it is tracking on the tape perfectly. So let's talk about some other things. You'll notice that all of the controls are shiny. I take everything out, clean it, shine it before I put it back in. You'll also notice that there's a slight crack in the plastic lens. That's okay. Almost all of them that I get have cracks. I will usually glue it to make sure the crack doesn't get any worse. You don't see it on this when the cover's on, when the faceplate is on anyway. Now what we're going to do is I'll take you on a tour on the inside. This unit has been fully recapped. When I say this, I mean electrolytic capacitors have been replaced on the 3 main boards: the motherboard, the power supply, and the control board. Where I don't change capacitors unless I absolutely have to is on the display board. The display board has capacitors in it. They're very low value capacitors. If any of them went bad, it wouldn't necessarily take the display out. But I have not replaced the capacitors in the display board. I have rebuilt the motor, which is the take-up motor, which I always do these days because they get a lot of wear and tear. The take-up motor operates at two different voltages. One voltage when it's rewinding or fast forwarding, another voltage when it's acting just as take-up. I did replace the sensor for whether you are using a metal tape, or sorry, a regular tape or a chromium dioxide tape. Notice that changes, and that has to do with the notches on the back of a chrome or high bias tape. And also replace the capacitors here. And this, you'll notice whenever I hit this button, it engages. What it does is it retentions the tape. Well, there's a small leaf switch back here that I had to replace. This leaf switch was intermittent, had an intermittent connection, and that connection was affecting the lights and the way the deck acted. Okay, now I'm going to go off tripod and we're going to look at what's going on the inside. All right, now that we're looking at the inside, the take-up motor has been taken out and rebuilt. When you're looking at these, if you don't buy mine, that's fine. Buy somebody else's, but make sure that they have recapped the motherboard or the power supply. The power supply, and I have sold these without recapping the power supply. I had pulled caps, checked them, they were fine. Everything was good on the power supply. And then I did encounter a power supply that was bad, and I decided I would start to recap all the power supplies in all the units that I sell from now on. So any of these that I get in, the power supply is the first to get recapped. And they're good quality capacitors I get from Mouser, so it's not an issue. But make sure, if you don't buy mine, make sure that they've recapped the power supply. The second thing that they really need to recap is the control board. And the control board has several capacitors. This capacitor back here in particular, I believe that's the right one, is responsible for shut off whenever you've reached tape's end. And you know that's going bad when the tape has gone to the end and it struggles and struggles and struggles for 5 or 10 seconds and then finally shuts off. The interval should be 3 seconds because it takes 3 seconds for that to charge up and dissipate, firing power back at a transistor that lets the solenoid go. So, you know, again, control board is the second thing, right? Let me point one other thing out. I haven't done this in a lot of videos, but you see that little wire there? See this? That wire? That's an anti-static wire. That's actually connecting the chassis to the isolated tape transport. And I say isolated tape transport because everything here is on plastic or is touched by belts. And so what can happen is static can build up and it'll discharge. And the way it'll manifest itself is it'll sound like a ticking sound through the speakers, through the output. So it's really odd. But I make these. If I didn't get a good one, with the unit, then I'll go ahead and make one for the unit. They all should have them, including the CT-F900 and the 1250. Over here is the motherboard. Now the motherboard, again, as I said, has been fully recapped. When I say that, it's the electrolytic capacitors that have been replaced. Also, each of these switches are responsible for different functions. This particular one is the most problematic. This one controls Dolby in and out. And what I do is I take this apart and I clean the inside, and then I deox it so that it is free of crackle. same thing with the other ones, although they don't tend to present problems too much. You'll notice that there are several potentiometers with some marks on the board. I will mark them when I get them, and then as I'm making adjustments per the manual, I will then alter those if I need to. But for the most part, they're pretty close to where the original spec was. Okay, that pretty much is it on the inside. The only other thing I do let folks know is the volume, which is a double pot, and the output volume double pot, and the bias controls. These are all pots. I deoxit all of those. All right, we're going to go back onto tripod, and we're going to start talking about some of the testing. We'll talk about how the unit works. So in this part of the video, we're going to go through some tests, and we're going to start off with a very common tape type, which is called type 1. These tapes are still being made today, not by Maxell. You can buy these new old stock on eBay, but you can still get type 1 tapes. They're normal position. This deck has a sensor right here. See, right now it thinks it's 02. If you look at the back, I don't have an extra opening back here for the type 2 tapes. The type 2 tapes, which are high bias tapes, do have an opening, and that's why that sensor is showing. There's a little sensor here that when I put my type 1 tape in, will tell the deck it's a type 1 tape for bias. Type 2 tapes are what we call high bias tapes. They will produce a little less tape hiss and a little higher highs than a type 1. And then there was type 3. Type 3 is a ferrochrome tape. And the type 3 tapes, they don't make these anymore. They stopped making these in 1985. They came out at a time where they did not do any kind of special notching on the back. So this deck would look at this tape and think it's a type 1 tape, but you can override that with this button, which would set it to FECR. So type 1 tape, very common. Type 2 tape, very common. And a type 3 tape, not so common, but can be recorded on this deck. So we're going to start with the type 1 tape. And the way I'm going to set this is I'm going to bring my input volume up. I'm going to start recording, but I'm going to use it on a monitor mode. When I say monitor, that means that, remember, you've got 2 tape heads here. You've got a record and a playback head. And when it's on tape monitor, you're going to hear what has just been recorded on that tape. So we'll get started doing that, and I'll make a selection. So let me start that now. Okay. Now notice the difference there. I have Dolby in, and when I turn this all the way to the left, do you notice that you get better treble? In the middle it's pretty flat, and to the right it's dull. Now let's play this back. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use I'm going to use the counter repeat. I've got this button depressed so that at 0 it'll start playing when I go to rewind. We'll talk a little more about these controls as we test out the unit. Oh, and one other thing. You notice that I just turned the volume down. This is the output volume. It does not affect the input. It's only affecting the output. But it does register on the view meters. Okay? So let's go ahead and see how that recording does. Now listen for when I change the bias. It's coming up. Hear it? Now I can also play this without Dolby. So that gives you a demonstration on a Type 1. And you could see that using the bias fine adjust actually had an impact on that tape. If you like something that has more treble, on certain tapes, that bias will act that way. Now, if I put a TDK-D tape in there, it may not act the same way. It has to do with the tape and the tape formulation. Now, the next test is going to be with a Type 2. This is what we call a chromium dioxide tape, but chromium dioxide tapes came out in the 70s, and it just has to do with the type of coating that is on the tape. You get lower hiss, and you have better saturation, better highs as well. Now, we're going to go ahead and record the same selection on this tape, and we're going to do the same thing that we did before. But notice, just by putting that tape in, it has sensed that it's a CRO2 tape, and that's because of the hole, extra hole here, right? So we'll go ahead and tee that up. Let me make sure nothing is playing, and then we will start with the same selection again. And I'll keep the input volume where it was. Okay, so let's start. This time I started and I held the pause in, so now I'm going to unpause it and start to record. Let's see how bias works now. Acts pretty similar to a Type 1 tape. I have it back in the middle. Now let's listen to that and see what that sounds like. You can hear me playing with the bias. Actually sounds good right in the middle. So that's a Type 2 tape. Okay, for the next test, we're going to test the Ferrochrome tape that I had talked about before. So again, Ferrochrome is not something that's made anymore. They stopped production in 1985. It will record perfectly fine on this deck if you can find them and you want to use them. Notice that when I put the tape in, the Ferrochrome indicator didn't light up, and that's because of the notches on the back of the tape don't affect the sensor. The sensor that's in there is really for the Chrome tape setting. So you have this little override here that will set it for Ferrochrome. Now the bias will be set properly for Ferrochrome and it should record without any issue. So once again, to start our test, we're going to be using Dolby In. We're going to listen as it's being recorded, and I'm going to use the same source material that I have been using, and I think I had that somewhere around 4.5. Okay, so we'll get that started now. Now we'll adjust the bias. The bias acts pretty much the same on this type of tape as a type 1. We're going to go back and play this. If you can hear it, this is where I adjusted bias to the left and then back all to the right. And then back to the middle. So what you can see is a little bit about how the bias adjustment worked, about how the tape sensor works with a Ferrochrome tape, and at this point you've pretty much seen everything about the deck in terms of how it functions. One of the things that I will point out is that when you're let me turn amp down a little bit. When you are playing source material or something from the cassette tape, you have 3 controls for the view meters. You have a peak, you have a peak hold, and an average. What you've been watching is average, and what I'll do is put it on peak hold, and now you see the highest segment remains lit, so it's held. So if what you're trying to do is make sure that your recording doesn't go like above +3, for example, you would set that, listen to some of the source material, and then readjust to make sure that it doesn't go beyond whatever peak you had there. Now it also has just peak. And the difference between peak and average essentially is it looks a little more reactive on peak than average. Average is a little slower. It truly averages the signal coming in rather than peak, which is the signal as it is immediately. There's no averaging being done. So it's not taking a number of samples and averaging them out as average does. I tend to use average because peak tends to give me sort of a false understanding of maybe I'm gone too high with my meters. But it's nice to have that functionality. Some other things that you can work with on this deck include the timer start. So right now it's set to play, and all that means is that if you have a tape and you have that tape queued up, when you add power, when you power up the system, that tape, when it's on timer start and play, the deck will immediately start playing. Okay? It also has the feature for record start. Now, for you to understand this, it's sort of like the old VCRs were. There was a timer that you would hook up to this, and it's just a timer that turns the unit on, powers the unit at a certain time. But people would record FM broadcasts or AM broadcasts, radio broadcasts at certain points in time during the day. And so what they do is they would set their deck up with the timer to pop on at a certain time and start recording, and then pop off and maybe start recording at another time to capture a radio broadcast. So you can see this automatically started recording. And of course, then there is defeating it with just hitting the off button, and then it will just not do anything when you turn it on. Okay. And then the last bit is these memory repeat buttons. This is really nice because what you can do is if you have a tape that that you're listening to both sides, or you're listening to, this only plays one side at a time, but you're listening to and you want it to keep playing the same side, what you can do is you can set it for end repeat, so that when it gets to the very end of the tape, what will happen is it will rewind automatically, and then it'll play that side over again. So pretending that we had done that, it's now at the end, and it just starts playing again. So while this is not an auto reverse cassette deck, it doesn't auto reverse, it doesn't play both sides, it only plays one side at a time. That's a nice feature that I don't think I saw on many decks after that. I used to sell these in the late 70s, early 80s. So that concludes the testing portion of the video. The next is I'm going to turn the unit around so that you can see the serial number information. I like to do this because I like to make sure that folks know that they are getting what they are getting, that they're actually getting the unit that that has been videoed. So I'm going to turn this around, okay, and we'll focus on a couple of things. First, you can see that I have a couple of stickers, a QA checklist. These stickers can be removed. They come right off. And then I have a service repair record, which details all the things that I had to do. So for example, this one had to have, I believe I put a new power cord on this one, yeah. But it has all of the other things that were done to the unit, just so you have it. The serial number on this one, while not very easy to see necessarily here, is YJ3615735. And I'll zoom in on that because I'm going to go off tripod and show you blemishes, things that that aren't quite right with the unit, things that you need to know about before you buy it. And when I say not quite right, just cosmetically not right. You should be able to see that serial number fairly well now. Now I'm going to move around to the front of the deck. Now we're at the front of the deck, and I want to point out a few cosmetic blemishes. There's a little bit of a scuff there. This corner looks pretty good. Pretty good through here. You do have some minor scuffs in this area. You do have a little bit of a dent right down there by the Pioneer symbol. But overall, pretty good. The plastic on this is a little worn. You can see it. And I'll show you underneath, not that people are going to be looking underneath. See that a little bit of a scratch there, a little bit of a dent there. Yeah, underneath you can see it. It was a little scratched, but again, sort of going through detail here. The top looking pretty good. This corner got hit. This happens on all of these units. If you get a unit that does, if you get a faceplate that doesn't have anything wrong with the corners, you're lucky. So that gives you a really good view of the unit overall. One thing you do need to know is the bonnet for this is actually the bonnet for a CT-F900, and the way you know that is the CT-F900 is the only one that had 4 screw mounts on the back, on the sides. And the top right one there is non-functional. Even on the 1250. I took this off of a 1250 that I replaced with a wooden cabinet that I made, but I stripped this and painted it. So it's in pretty good condition from paint standpoint. Okay, so that takes you on a full tour of this CT-F900 3-head cassette deck made by Pioneer in the late 1970s. What a great deck this is. Thank you for taking time to stick through this whole video. I really appreciate it. And if you're interested in purchasing this, there will be a link down below to the eBay listing. Thanks.